Welcome to the meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I am Councillor Marie-Therese Rossi. I'm the chair of the OSC, and I will be chairing tonight's meeting. The event is being streamed on YouTube, and members of the public can watch there and listen to what is taking place. So I would like to welcome everyone who is in the chamber. I know we have some members of the public and also those who are watching on YouTube. I think it would be appropriate for us to start with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. So before we start the meeting tonight, I would ask members of the committee to only switch on their microphones when they are speaking and then to switch them off. And the same applies to members of the public if they wish to speak later on. So firstly, we have apologies for absence for this evening, Councillor Kazim Ali and Councillor Beryl Cox. Do any members have interest to declare? No? So I have the minutes of the meeting at the 24th of January. They have been circulated. Does the committee agree to sign them as a correct record? Okay. The first item on the agenda tonight is the State of the Borough Address, and we have the Chief Executive, Dr. Barry Quirk, and the Leader of the Council, Elizabeth Campbell, here to answer questions and also to present the item. Barry?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I sort of feel I should go down there or somewhere to minimise the gap between us. I'm just basically going to address, first of all, the strategic context that we're in and how that's changed and how it's likely to change further. And then Councillor Campbell, the leader, will speak about the future direction, the strategic direction of the authority. So, obviously, context has been everything in the last couple of years, and I think it's really important, and I apologise if this is stuff you already know, and also if there's issues that you might want to stop me on. This presentation will at the same time be, so it's behind me, but at the same time it will be on the Council's Teams system so that the public can see, and you'll have a copy of this as well. And then the first one's got the smallest writing in, so I apologise, but you could have sat closer, or we could have had this further towards you. But basically, I think the first question that I think we face in the context is, have we seen the back of COVID? And I think to answer that, public health colleagues would say there's a pandemic, definition of epidemic, and definition of endemic. And that really is about the extent to which a disease is spread throughout a population. And the estimate of the Chief Medical Officer is that it will not become endemic, which is the lowest level of, which is an endemic disease, diseases that we're all familiar with and we can have from time to time. And the estimate of Chief Medical Officer is that that won't happen but for at least 5 years. In other words, there's possibilities of epidemics from now, but we're not in a pandemic. We're moving out from a pandemic into an epidemic. And this simply gives the numbers of people who tested positive in Kensington and Chelsea over the last 7 days. It's 620, 621. There's been 1 death in the last 7 days for which the person had COVID within 28 days. 21 people were admitted to Chelsea and Westminster Hospital with COVID, and the virus tests conducted in this area is nearly 9,000. So you can see there is much less than it was last year, and it's lessening, and the issues about this in terms of hospitalization rates and death rates is significantly lower than it was, but it's certainly still present, which is why we should be alert but not alarmed at the statistics that we get every day on COVID. I thought I'd just say something about the population of the borough, because we should be finding out within the next few weeks and months about the population in relation to the 2021 census that was done last year. We're concerned about that census because, of course, it was done during a pandemic and when many people in London weren't actually in London. They'd gone outside of London. But what this does, this looks at, for 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and so on, the numbers, literally the numbers with different axes. So the left side is London, the right side is Kensington and Chelsea. And basically, compared to London, we have a lower ratio of children, a slightly higher ratio of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and a much higher rate of people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So by comparison to London, we are older as a population. I don't want to go through that, it's too long-winded. But what I would say is that who was here during the pre-pandemic? So before the pandemic, we were doing lots of work looking at our workforce, but I mean people that work in Kensington and Chelsea, as well as looking at people who are residents and looking at the overlap between the residents and workforce. And what we've discovered is, of course, that there's about 160,000 people resident here, of which 15,000 also are resident elsewhere. We have a local workforce of 110,000, and that local workforce, whether it's working for the council or health service or private organisations, about 85 to 90% of those people live elsewhere. They come into Kensington and Chelsea. And then we were having 60,000 visitors a day. All in all, any one day, we had 300,000 people in Kensington and Chelsea. And then during the pandemic, the visitors dropped to about 6,000, a tenth by 90%. The workforce dropped in all areas other than essential services like direct health service, also things like retail, Tesco's and Sainsbury's and Waitrose and whatever. But other than those essential workers, most people were working remotely. And so during that pandemic, the average footfall in this borough fell by at least a third. So from 300,000 a day to under 200,000 a day. That's our best estimates. Now, the only information that we have at the moment about, well, where are we now, is information from Transport for London that published a week ago, information on their ridership, they call it. And the underground passenger numbers are still at 54% of their pre-pandemic, and bus ridership is at 73% of pre-pandemic. So we're still at a position where across London as a whole, half of people are travelling on the underground, that was previously, and 3/4 are travelling on buses. So we're not really through this pandemic in relation to people's behaviour. their daily behaviour. And that has a very important bearing on us because we are probably the authority with the most people coming in relative to the number of people that live here, whether that's to visit or to work or to explore the cultural offer. And I think that is the issue for Central London, the Central Activity Zone, which is about reviving, recovering that sense of people coming to London to work and to gather. I just thought I'd say the only information that we have from the government and from ONS on the 2021 population was published 2 days ago in relation to the number of Ukrainian Russian nationals. I think it's really helpful that the ONS published this very quickly, and I thought because of the topicality of the issue, I ought to advise you about this. Now, on the left side in those 2 columns is the difference between the number of, so for example, there are 24,500 people of Russian nationality who live in London, and there are 27,660 who live in the rest of England. And you can see in terms of Ukrainians, there's slightly more of a majority, but not much more, 18,990, compared to 18,010, who are living in the rest of England. But certainly by comparison to other East European nationals that live in England, both the Russian population and the Ukrainian population are more concentrated in London than any other of the population. So, for example, I think the Polish population is 600,000 in England, and of that, I think it's no more than 10% are in London, not 50%. Now, the Ukrainian nationals that are living, obviously, and this is a really important issue for us because, of course, of the Russian embassy, the Ukrainian embassy, and the issues that there's been in relation to ensuring that people can peaceably protest at the various sites, as well as commemorate at the Ukrainian memorials. But they're reasonably spread, this population in London, so that the image would tends to think all people are very concentrated, but actually the highest number is in Newham, and that's 1,340, and in West London in Ealing and Hounslow. We have 420 Ukrainian nationals that were here on the census last year. As to whether that's a higher number now or a lower number, that was the snapshot as at last year. Whereas in Russians, the Russian nationals is largest in Westminster at 2,260, and then Tower Hamlets, and then ourselves at 1,620. And that is much more concentrated than the Ukrainian population in terms of spatial distribution, and we have 1,620. So that is the position. It just describes what the both Russian and Ukrainian nationals and their distribution within England, and how they're concentrated in London, and where that concentration is within London. I was looking at and now I've moved to the economic prospects and what we're thinking about, what's being thought about the economy. I looked at the reports by Greater London Authority's economic department. They do scenarios and they publish this every month. And I'm not expecting people to look at these graphs, but essentially the graphs was showing the difference between output recovery and the difference between job recovery. And people were concerned at the beginning of last year about the imminent prospects of a lot of joblessness. This didn't crystallize in Maine. The job market, the labour market was really flexible, and it would appear that we were very concerned, all the public agencies were concerned really about the ceasing of the furlough arrangements and so on, but that job recovery really was going quite well in relation to London. But essentially you've got to think of this. We had a decade of no growth until the pandemic, from 2010 to 2020. Then we had 2 years of pandemic, and now the prospect, both the Bank of England and other forecasters are prospecting another decade of no or low growth. So we'll have 2 decades, really, a generation where there's no economic growth. in London. That is the forecast that we're facing now. This is me saying, look, there's lots of headwinds and crosswinds here, whether it's changes to net migration, the financial sector, the Russian-Ukraine effects, which are just being baked into by the Bank of England, trying to work out what the effects of these are. Tourism effects, there's a particular impact on London and a special impact on us. There's the levelling up agenda and the extent to which this will be marked at all in London by comparison to Midlands and the North. But there's other issues as well, like international trade volatility and so on. So there are an awful lot of headwinds and crosswinds which probably dampen the optimism of those people that are producing economic scenarios, which is why I think the Bank of England is forecasting no growth in the next year. The Levelling Up white paper contains one page, which is a map of Kensington and Chelsea, and this is the page. And it comes from, and the contrast is in the Levelling Up white paper is with Middlesbrough. What they're contrasting really is how the income deprivation, the material economic deprivation in Kensington and Chelsea is very spatially marked, whereas in other places it's much more distributed. And there's inequalities, obviously, at different scales. There's inequalities within a locality, and there's this map here is about inequalities, income deprivation inequalities within Kensington and Chelsea, with the more red, it's the more deprived, the more blue, the less deprived. But obviously there are inter-regional inequalities as well, inequalities within London. The Levelling Up agenda is primarily about inter-regional inequalities, which is about addressing the issues of the Midlands and the North East. Whereas in London, London has a population of 9 million. It's estimated that 2.4 million of those people are living in relative poverty, which is double the population of the whole of Birmingham. And therefore, if one was to look at this simply in number terms, you would say, well, there's a big levelling up agenda that exists within London, not as well as within Kensington and Chelsea. But the government agenda is principally at the moment about regional inequalities and then intra-regional inequalities. Not really focusing on locality inequalities. Now, this is how the pandemic has intensified, amplified, and exacerbated existing problems. So you look at the middle two charts, middle two diagrams here. That was universal claimants in March 2020, which is the second one, and universal claimants in October 2021. And you can see, really, what's happened is just intensification in areas of universal credit claimants. So what we're not seeing is a spreading of deprivation across Kensington and Chelsea, but much more about this being intensified in particular areas. We as a council track those on low-income households. We do a dashboard, we're tracking households that we support as a council, and actually 10% of the households that we support because they're on low income don't actually live in Kensington and Chelsea, and that's because we've placed them in temporary accommodation elsewhere. So the figures, the diagrams here are about the 90%, they're not about the 100%, because 10% we're actually placing elsewhere. So we have 6,500 households that live below the poverty line, as determined, and 5,900 live in food poverty. Now this information, we compare it, for example, with our citizens panel that we did, and we asked people, had they used food banks, and actually it was 5%, which is this number. So we have both our own information and we have what the citizens are saying, and we know that roughly 1 in 20 people are reliant on food banks. And what this demonstrates here in these maps is the intensification if you take ever more stricter views about this. This is it's like party trick of mine. This describes income inequality, and what it looks at, the most unequal area in the whole of London is ourselves, as we know. That's why we're referred to in the Levelling Up white paper. The median, in other words, the middle borough, the borough with the middle level of inequality, is Hounslow. And the borough with the least inequality is Barking and Dagenham. Now, you can have the least inequality and everyone be extremely wealthy, or the least inequality and everyone be extremely poor. So it's not necessarily, you have got to look at this. And what the difference is between the median income of a household and the average income or the mean income. Now, what this describes is the difference between this in Barking and Dagenham is just £4,000. In Hounslow, it's 14,000, which is the middle, and for us, it's the 134,000. So if you think of it this way, there are 9 people having a party, and they all earn 25,000. So these 9 people earn 25,000. If the 10th person arrives, you can calculate what the 10th person must earn to bring the median up to the mean. And in Barking and Dagenham, 9 people earning 25,000 means that the 10th person will have to earn 65,000. In Hounslow, the 10th person would have to earn 168,000. In Kensington and Chelsea, the 10th person would have to earn 1.38 million. This describes in its starkest way what is really quite large income inequality, certainly the largest in the UK. And that is factored really by the very fact that we have over 20,000 social housing units, homes in Kensington and Chelsea, of which the council has 6,500 and the registered providers and housing associations another. And yet we have social housing marbled into what is super prime and prime real estate in London. This really is a feature of the way in the urban form of London of the last 100 years. It's not a feature of the driving inequality that exists in this place. It's not the place that creates the inequality. It's the fact that people of modest and poor incomes have been supported to live in areas of super prime property, which in other cities in the world they wouldn't. So it's a reflection of the fact that tenure refracts income and wealth. We are now developing a much better analysis of the tenure of the borough. If you look at the Greater London Authority's examination of tenure, it says that 26% of homes are owned outright, that 12% are owned on a mortgage. This is a very unusual mix. It's normally the other way round. But in other words, people purchase outright. We've then got 36% of people who live here living in social housing, of which 70% live in housing association property. Now, the 27% who live in private rented, it's a very, very different private rented than exists in other parts of London. In fact, we currently estimating that this figure is wrong, and we have a higher number of people living in private rented because they're privately renting from people that own outright. And therefore, we're trying to develop a much better understanding, particularly of the private rented sector in some parts of the borough, which is not aping the super prime or prime real estate, but which is where we're having to do work to make sure it's properly regulated, it's up to standard, and so on. And so the issue here is about the action, yes, on our own stock as an authority, but also the action that we must do with others in the housing association sector, but also in the private rented sector to make sure that what we've got is accessible, more affordable housing at all price points, not just at the top price point. In terms of child poverty rates in central London after housing costs, we are the authority on the far right of that. In other words, we do have 24%, it's been said a number of times in the council chamber, the proportion, but actually that proportion is low number. It's only about 6,000. Therefore, it's a tractable number. Many of the 6,000 are people that our children's services have connection with every day and that our schools have connection with. So we're not trying to raise poverty, ambition, we're not trying to raise things amongst 30, 40,000 children, but amongst about 6,000. So this is a tractable issue that we can focus on, and that's the issue that's been driving us in relation to narrowing the gap. Now, I just want to say a couple of things on cost of living. There was a research briefing published yesterday in the House of Commons on the rising cost of living in the UK. And we know that inflation hit 5.5% in January. We know, or we estimate, the best estimates are that it's going to go to 8.5% in April, that the average inflation rate for the whole of this calendar year is expected to be 7%. And it's forecast to return but to 5% by the year end. So an average of 7% over the year. And as you can see, that is the Bank of England forecast, which is it declining over the following 2 years. And this obviously is about energy, food and fuel. But added to that is the uncertainties, of course, of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and what impact that might have, what reverberative impact that might have, not just on the immediate parts of Europe, but also on the UK. Now, this is an issue across, as you can see, across Italy, across the whole of the EU is 5.1%, across Germany, Spain and so on. This isn't a uniquely British challenge, but certainly there's 2 years of really high cost. So we've got 10 years of no growth, 2 years of pandemic, 2 years of cost of living problem, and then probably no growth for another 10 years. And so we've always got to be thinking of ways as a council, how do we do things that are adding value to the public, adding value to our service users, but which are basically being done probably on a lower cost base all the time. We must always be thinking about lower cost base. And that's not just annually, or we set our budget for the year. If we were a business, we would have a cash committee that would be looking at our budget month by month to make sure that we were reducing our cost base month by month by month, not just 1 year and then the next year. The other aspect of this, of course, is the proportion of total spend by different households on electricity and gas and food and non-alcoholic drink. And as you can see, it's those 20% of the total spending of people on the lowest household income is on that, and it's 11% of those on the highest. So we're talking about a doubling impact of those people on the lowest income. So, excuse me, really, I think that there are these 4 challenges that we're doing. There's the impact of the cost of living crisis in Kensington and Chelsea, on Kensington and Chelsea's residents, all of them. There's the, which is differentially impacted. There's the trying to achieve over the longer term our net zero targets. There's the number one issue for Londoners, which is reducing crime and the fear of crime. And there's the housing investment challenge that we've got about accessibility and affordability and investment. And I would suggest that in each of these, the council's contribution is probably no more than 10%. We cannot solve the problems of these things. This is out with our functional responsibility, out with our power, but we have a responsibility, a convening responsibility, to do more of what we do better and to use our positive influence on all those other agencies to actually achieve bigger change. And with that, I'll finish and hand over to Councillor Campbell.
Thank you very much, Barry. Elizabeth?
Well, as Barry said, I think that the next 10 years are going to be quite daunting, actually, and I'm an optimistic person. But the updated council plan and supporting progress report sets out what our communities have told us, what's important to them, consolidates our progress, and it outlines our aspirations for the borough in the future. At the same time, our new strategic business plan sets out our major activities and the work in the year ahead. So you'll remember, Madam Chairman, that we in 2019 set out a vision for Kensington and Chelsea in our council plan, which focused on achieving better outcomes for all who live, work and visit here. And the vision was shaped by the changes we knew we needed to make after the Grenfell tragedy. And since then, we've made important changes to our policies, to our culture, and I think probably most importantly, to the way that we work with our residents. We've tried to make sure that the lessons of Grenfell are at the forefront of our drive for change. But we know there's so much more to do to bridge the gap between the council and its communities and to ensure that we are the best that we can possibly be. So COVID-19 has affected all of us in the borough. But, you know, as Barry said, it's affected some people more than others, and it's exacerbated the existing inequalities. And recovering from what has been an absolutely unprecedented health and economic crisis is a significant long-term challenge for us. As we start to live with COVID, our residents and businesses not only have to deal with the economic effects of the pandemic and its impact on mental and physical health, but also, as Barry said, with this rising cost of living. And at the same time, it's impossible for us not to feel moved and really extremely angry by what's happening in the Ukraine. This humanitarian crisis, as well as having huge challenges and huge implications for countries right across the world, including our own, mean that we need to continue to ensure that we support those who are vulnerable and who really need our help. And as we support our communities through these challenges, we'll listen both to their concerns and to their ambitions so that our efforts are always guided by what matters most to them. And as our council plan progress report outlines, we have many strengths on which to build. We're investing £600 million in our council homes, schools, streets and public spaces. And as we do so, we will work with our partners, residents and businesses to renew our focus on sustainability and protecting the environment. And to make sure that our buildings are as green as possible, as a first step, we will be investing £100 million in our housing estates, £8 million in our schools, and £4 million in council buildings. As we look forward to tackle the long-term and complex challenges facing the borough, we will continue to put communities at the heart of everything we do. So I'm very pleased that the community in Earls Court have come here tonight, Madam Chair, to make their concerns and their recommendations to you. And I look forward to hearing what conclusion you've come to and your report to the leadership team in due course. So finally, I'd just like to end by saying I hope that this updated council plan and business plan will provide a really firm foundation for the future while we continue to learn the lessons of the past. And I look forward to working with our partners and our residents to make these plans a reality.
Thank you. We seem to have run it. The next item on the agenda is the council plan, and I think the way things are going, we should run both of these two items together. And what I will do is I will ask questions first from the committee, and then I will ask members of the public if they wish to ask any questions. So I would just like to start with one question to Barry, which I thought it was a very good presentation. You mentioned in it that we have a lot of people in temporary housing. We know that we have taken in hundreds of Afghan refugees. And so the question I'm asking is, do you know at this point if we are going to take in, or have we been asked to take in any Ukrainian refugees, or where we stand with that?
Currently, the government has changed its approach to this. It was dealt with solely by the Home Office, and as of 2 days ago, a new minister was appointed, reporting both to the Home Secretary but also to Michael Gove. So it sits across both DLUC, as it's now known, and the Home Office. And so I'm hoping that and it's only been in the last 2 days, because hitherto with all of our discussions about Afghans have been with the Home Office, and the leaders had more of the discussions certainly than I have. But I'm sort of hopeful that the arrangements will really step up very quickly in respect of potential Ukrainian refugees. Look, I did point out that I sort of glossed over it, but it was up there, which is that the population of London has actually dropped for the first time, according to the GLA estimates. We'll know when the 2021 census comes out, but it dropped by 150,000. Now, in the past, the only rise in our overall population arose because of net international migration. So my guess is that this net international migration will be a benefit to us. But the practical thing about when we know of individuals, but what we don't know at the moment is of a managed process, and I haven't heard about that, but the minister's only been appointed 2 days ago.
Members of the committee, Councillor Hammond first, please.
Harrington.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to both Elizabeth and Barry. And Barry, we will miss these tour de force presentations after the summer. But can I ask, well, perhaps both of you, and we've had to do a lot of things differently over the last 2 years with the pandemic, and one or two obvious things are here to stay, like the paperless parking permits, which have been widely welcomed in consultation, and outdoor dining. Can you tell us what else has changed that you think can be embedded, if there's anything less obvious in the way the council does business that can help us move forward in a positive way, things that we've learnt?
I certainly think in terms of both professional and public service practice, the fact that people in children's services and in adults have supported vulnerable people in a continuous way, and yet the way in which people have operated and worked has been very different. And so it's drawing on how people work differently and yet still sustain the service and still sustain face-to-face connection with people, and not doing it just simply through one cannot work with vulnerable people and work with people who are disadvantaged and at risk, living at risk, maybe in their own families, can't do that other than face-to-face. And so I think that it's using new working practices could make us more efficient in the longer term or in the medium term. And I do think that we've learnt a lot from that in terms of the organisation overall. I also think that there'll be many more things that will go, because the whole of the digital agenda just quickly, within days, changed. In March 2020, it just changed. And I do think that the demands have changed, therefore, as well, from the public. There's much more, people expect things to be much quicker, much more seamless, and we have to move in that direction for almost all of our services.
I'd say that one of the big things that's happened over the last 2 years is a complete sea change in our relationship with the businesses. Prior to the pandemic, we didn't really have sort of huge databases of our businesses, but they've really needed a lot of help over the last few years, and all the grants, the massive amounts of grants, I think more than £40 million come through us, mean that we had to check in with them, make sure that we distribute things really quickly. I think that on the one hand there's grant giving, and B, I think on the other hand there's people going out just advising them. If you remember, the regulations changed every minute. So businesses needed a lot of advice and guidance, which we gave. Thirdly, I think we've changed from being a very tightly regulated and restrictive organisation, whereas now we're trying to encourage businesses to survive and be open and expand. Because as Barry said, you know, you look at the visitor numbers, which have plummeted by a third. None of our residents want to live near decimated high streets. So there's been a whole thing about how can we help businesses, and you mentioned the alfresco revolution, which has just been extraordinary. But also, how do we encourage visitors to come here? And we had a digital carnival. That was pretty amazing. We had the Summer of Love. We attracted 30,000 visitors through that. So it's about us as a council being more proactive to attract people in here to come to our businesses and enjoy being here. I think that's been quite a big sea change. And I'd like to say, wow, 3 business improvement districts. That will really help, I think, over the next few years to make sure that our high streets are really thriving.
Thanks very much. And I won't have a supplementary question on that, but just picking up on the chairman's question about Ukrainian refugees, I do want to say thank you to Barry, because I wrote to Barry yesterday when a Ukrainian refugee has appeared in my ward in a hotel. And I had a call from an officer this morning, first thing, and people are reaching out from the council. So very grateful indeed for that very speedy service. Thank you.
So, Greg, can I come back to you? I mean, frankly, there's been progress in so many different areas. I'll just have to say, please look at page 4 and 5, because if I keep reading them out, you'll be here all night, and I know you've got people from Elscourt who wish to speak to you.
Councillor Lindsay.
Thank you, Chairman. My question, Barry, you alluded to the population of London going down and KNC going down likewise. One of the good things about that might be a reduction in homelessness across London, although not necessarily in KNC because there are specific reasons. Is that the case? Do you know that? Because clearly, if there are less people in London but a finite number of houses, that ought to mean that more people are housed. Is that the case?
I think that would only be the case if the homeless left. I think the homeless stayed with us. There is a sort of mathematical logic in what you're saying, which is that there is a finite number of properties, but it's changing all the time as well. More are being increased, some are being knocked down, but there is a finite number of properties. But it's not impacting on homelessness, because what properties is it that homeless people are going to be allocated? And it's principally in social housing. And you know, people in social housing are not leaving. And so, therefore, I'm afraid I don't think it's going to impact on homelessness in London. I think it could if it was look, for half of my life, London's population was declining. It was only in 1985 it started increasing again, and it only reached its pre-war figure in 2016. So London's population has declined quite substantially and then grown again since 1985. This is the first time that it's decreased, that it's estimated to have decreased by 150,000. I think that the growth, I personally think that London will continue to grow again. The forecast from the GLA is that we'll go back up over the 9 million again very quickly, and then up to 10 million over to 2035. But homelessness really is about access to houses at the right price. And unlike the rest of England, 2/3 of Londoners rent, either from the social sector or from the private sector. The rest of England is probably about 25% rent. So therefore, the housing structure in London is just fundamentally different and causes this rationing problem.
Just add to that, because of the problem with homelessness, that's exactly why we've committed to build 600 homes, of which 50% will be social rent. And I'm very glad to say that 2 schemes have already started building. because we just don't have enough houses or homes for people who need them at the right price.
Thank you. So, Councillor Mobaktia, wish to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Barry, for this comprehensive presentation. My question is to Elizabeth. Our residents, through consultation, identified 13 points which matters to them, present, and I would like to mention 2 of them only. One of them is crime, antisocial behavior, and safety and security, and the other one including the inequality that was very present there, and fuel and food poverty, which is doubling and tripling in the coming weeks if the crisis and war continues in Europe, in Ukraine. And numbers of students who are lagging behind because of the pandemic. Are these 2 points going to be on the top of the agenda in the next year for the council agenda? Yes, yes.
Excuse me, Councillor. So you're saying, is crime going to be at the top of our agenda as one thing? And I'd say, yes, we spent £400 million investing in CCTV. We've also got a lot of strategies for youth crime as well. So yes, that will be one of our priorities. Food banks, as Barry said, that you look at the absolute poverty and the numbers of people accessing our food banks, which I think you said was one in 20, yeah. Right? Which we've had corroborated by the citizens panel, and that is something that we have supported over the last couple of years with COVID. With your colleague, we helped sort of unload deliveries to the food banks, etc. So I'm sure that will be something that we continue to support. And what was your third one?
Fuel
poverty.
Gas and electricity bills, it's very high. It's more than £1,000 more.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm not sure as a council how we help on that, but I'll ask Barry. I mean, that's a tricky one, isn't it, Barry?
Yes, it is, and the issue really is about that there are. I bet I don't want to misspeak and give you the wrong information, but there are arrangements in relation to energy rebates and so on, and council tax that we will provide to all councillors about what the proposals are for those. I have to say that there's something, but they're not as big as the challenge for individual households that are facing very large increases. The only positive thing one can say is that the cost of electricity and gas tends to be less in the next 9 months than it was in the previous 6 months. But nonetheless, I think the challenge to individuals is very great. And this is one of the areas where I said I think the council's ability to act is quite small, really. I do think that we should be we learned a lot from the work that we did in the early days of COVID by creating an interdisciplinary team of customer service workers that went out to connect to created hubs. When I think we need to learn from that in relation to food, but also in relation to giving advice about energy. Thankfully, there's not a significant fuel problem. I mean, the worst fuel problem is to the rural poor in England, bluntly. But I do think that these are challenges the council can assist and advise in, but we don't actually have the functional responsibility nor the resource to do much to all the households about.
Pascal.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Barry and Elizabeth for the introduction earlier on. I want to pick up on a point, since we're combining the plans with the reaction to your initial speeches, that in the business plan, page 41, there's an item called Funding Investment Strategy for Carbon Zero.
I think there have been considerable misunderstandings about the terms carbon zero and carbon net zero. The Green Plan, the Council Green Plan, sets it out very clearly. The carbon net zero commitment by 2030 is that we do as much as we can in terms of insulation and fabric improvement and those cost-effective items with regard to systems. And where we fail to get to carbon zero, there is thereafterwards either in the private sector, if it's through planning, a premium that's paid, or it's a provision paid in the public sector, which would be largely for us through the social housing. And therefore I welcome very much this piece of work that's been added. It's a short item in here, but I think it's a very big one. Elizabeth Campbell referred to the £100 million with regard to the social housing investment here. So it is a large item over 8 years. And that £100 million is as yet not funded. And that's why this piece of work is very important to find it. However, the Ether and Crom technical analysis shows this £100 million extra for the HRA funding as a housing revenue account capital funding over the next 8 years to achieve carbon zero, as is stated, via fabric improvements to Energy Performance Standard B and to install air source heat pumps. Would it not be better to install air source heat pumps when cost effective, because they're not cost effective now, and also that they would be running off a carbon neutral electricity grid nationally by circa 2035, 2040, although the government has not yet confirmed the dates for that, but it's that sort of time frame. This would achieve two things. It would achieve our carbon net zero by 2030 commitment. It would reduce fuel poverty by having a better insulated housing stock. And also would only require a small premium per annum to be provision rather, not premium, small provision to be made in the HRA following 2030. It would also, as a consequence, reduce the HRA funding requirement, which is mentioned as this piece of work, by circa 20 to 40 million pounds prior to 2030. So in effect, it would ease that £100 million pain, which was identified in the HRA paper in the last council meeting, by 20 to 40 million pounds, and bring this technology to bear when it was proven in the marketplace, cost effective, and working off carbon neutral electricity. And I commend that this area is looked at in detail following the council election.
Thank you, Councillor Pascal. You would like to take that up?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, if you're looking at it in your Environmental Select Committee, that sounds like a good idea, and I'm sure Johnny's always open to bright ideas.
But it's sorry if I could say that it's not just for Johnny's portfolio. This piece of work is under the portfolio of the Member for Finance and Customer Delivery. So it would cover both portfolios.
How grateful I am that you're looking at it in your Select Committee if it covers both.
Can I just make a comment myself about the council plan? That reminded me, it came up in our pre-meeting, that we've got several documents here and it's about 120 pages long. So the question was asked, how could we possibly do justice to all of this information, just in one OSC meeting? So I've been thinking about it, and I think the way I look at it is this, that the council plan is the overarching document and reference point for the whole council, and that what we should be doing in scrutiny, when we set our agenda or programme for the year, when we look at individual topics, we should be looking back always to the council plan, or now we've got the business plan, which gives us more detail, and we should be asking ourselves as scrutiny councillors, are we achieving what we aspire to achieve? Are we really, doing what we say? So my answer is that I think these documents can be used in scrutiny throughout the year as a reference point. I think they're, very well executed, and even though we can't do justice to them tonight, I think they will inform our work going forward over the next year. So that's all I had to say. So if any other member of the committee would like to ask a question. No? Sarah?
It's not really a question. I just wanted to thank Elizabeth and Barry and all the officers for everything they've done. When the council plan was first written, there was no COVID. And we've come a long way, I think. So, you know, thank you. And really, it's amazing what's been achieved, I think, in the last 2 years, considering what everybody's been facing. Thank you.
Do any other councillors have a question? Greg, did you have one?
No, I asked mine earlier. Thank you,
Okay,
Nancy.
thank you. Now go to the Earls Court councillors and ask them if they have any questions. So, Linda first.
Yes, Barry, it's about your comment about the reliance of the council effectively on RSLs in high property value areas. I think there's going to have to be, in order to retain the properties that we have, I think we're going to have, as a council, to examine how we fund and work with them. One, to ensure that sales of this property doesn't get made on the void valuation that housing associations have to make. And also to take the opportunity to make sure that the properties are actually up to standard. At the moment, it's a very unequal balance of how we work with RSLs. We place people in RSLs, but in fact the accommodation is sometimes not to standard. And then they will say, this is a high property value area, we will sell. And therefore, ultimately, we lose properties. So I'm just saying, as we don't have much dirt, the property that we're going to be building won't necessarily deliver the level of social rented housing at the low rental area. It'll probably be a combination of intermediate and other levels. But I think we do need to examine how we retain that low-level housing. And I'd like to know how the council is going to address that.
I don't think all the homes we're going to be building aren't going to be suitable. As I said, that we've made a commitment to have 50% at social rent. But I think you're absolutely right about RSLs. One thing that we will bring forward after the election is how we gosh, sorry, my mind's going. Is how we make sure that the standards are good enough, because, as you say, for several RSLs, it's not good enough, and we do need to be able to have the ability to go and check, frankly. That's one thing. So that's on the standard. On the other thing about them wanting to sell and move out, Kim and I remember going to see Clarion when they wanted to sell all their properties in Chelsea and build penthouses on the roof, and we had an enormous row with them because they said it wasn't affordable to upgrade and update their current properties. And in fact, they have remained in Chelsea, and they have modernised properties. So I think part of it is getting to know our RSLs much better, to have more conversations with them, which I know Kim is doing, and actually, frankly, to put them under pressure to maintain their properties at a proper level. But you're absolutely right. That's what Barry was pointing out. You know, we have 6,500 social homes, and the rest of the 28,000 are all in registered social landlords.
Do you think that actually it would have to be an opportunity for the council to come in and perhaps match fund to prevent sales, or get into a different partnership with housing associations?
What's that?
I think that the issue really is the variety and size of housing associations across London. So and they're consolidating into ever larger groups. So Peabody and Catalyst recently combined. London and Quadrant obviously did that a couple of years ago. And what's happening is that we're having larger, and this is probably because of the economics of their organisation, because they were set up particularly in West London, I have to say, by philanthropy in the end of the 19th century. They were established then, but they were repurposed at the end of the last century, but when it was the end of the, I think, second term Blair government, when essentially all local authority housing investment and development went to the housing associations. And really, for the last 20 years, housing associations have really been focusing a lot on development and not sufficiently, in my view, on the quality of management of their stock. That's something that is, I think, recognised now, that actually they need to focus on the quality of management of their stock. And they need to work with all the authorities in London, because I met a chief exec of one of the housing associations recently, and he said to me, well, we have 4,500 properties in Kensington and Chelsea, but they've got 90,000 somewhere else across London. And so when he's looking at changes, he's looking at the totality. And what I was explaining to him was that the almost revolution that this authority went through following the Grenfell tragedy about its attitude towards social housing. And, you know, we were an authority that had a managing agent managing our stock. We are now managing that. We brought that in-house with the support of the tenants and leaseholders, and we are now managing that, and we're using that as an example to other social landlords, and saying you've got to look much more about not just the investment, how many properties are you building, but what is the quality of your management, and how are you keeping your stock up to date in terms of investment, and not just looking at this as some sort of cost-benefit analysis based on the value of the land that's local. Because on that basis, you wouldn't build anything here. You'd be building, for every one property you build here, you could build 4 in Bexley, so you'd be spending your time focusing elsewhere. Actually, people in social housing have lived in this part of London, well, since the late 19th century. And so I think we've got to sustain that and keep it going. Otherwise, we're not going to have a sufficiently mixed community in central London, and I think that's desperately needed.
Malcolm or Hamish, do you wish to ask any questions about what you've heard? Malcolm.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just a brief point. I remember some years ago we were looking at increasing our revenue and doing it so it wouldn't hurt our core residents. And we had a scheme when we looked at empty properties, especially those that were owned offshore. And I wonder if there's any mileage in that, having seen what the government's done recently with certain properties in this borough, if we can put a premium on empty property which is owned offshore. That would contribute. And also, are we making much of the voluntary scheme, whereby if people want to contribute more, and you talked about the median income, 175,000 and the 1.6 million, we have a voluntary scheme. Are we actually promoting that, where people can contribute more if they want to?
We did look at a voluntary scheme, but when we consulted with our voluntary sector, they felt that it might, that the funds might come to the council rather than to them. And as they said, we have one of the most thriving voluntary sectors in the country. You don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul.
We are looking at the first point you made as well, and we are pursuing that. But essentially, the onus with an initiative and the license to this is with government, and so we're having discussions with government.
So we have some members of the public sitting patiently at the back. Bearing in mind that we are going to move swiftly on to the item on Earl's Court, are there any questions about what you've heard so far tonight that you would like to put to the leader or the chief executive? If not, we will move swiftly on to the agenda item on Earls Court. Thank you, Elizabeth and Barry. Thank you very much for coming. So this is the first time that we have done a call to action, and we have all of the Earls Court councillors here, and we have asked them to present to us, and in sort of up to 5 minutes, and I think Tom is going to time you. So I don't know which one of you would like to start. Malcolm.
Thank you, Chairman. We brought this first to the Adult Social Care and Health, and Marwan, Councillor Nagy, recognised this is a cross-cutting theme, and I believe you saw the importance of it, that it involves several different silos which haven't been working together. The call to action has taken nearly 18 months to come to this point. There is an 87-page version, which we didn't want to impose on you, but it does contain evidence from hundreds of residents, from police, from council wardens, council officers, and all our active residents associations. There is a 17-page executive version, but we hope this evening that the members will look favourably just on the executive 23 recommendations that you've got. They are sensible, they're proportionate, and they are achievable within council resources. Actually, some of them have already been adopted in that 18 months to get here. That's how realistic the recommendations are. Now, it's for leadership to make the decisions and to look at resources and the funding, but the whole community of Earls Court would be grateful to you this evening if you could endorse our plan and send it on to leadership. It will be democratic, and it will be overview and scrutiny working well. Our inboxes have been overwhelmed with complaints about ASB incidents in the last few years. Children have been terrified coming home from school. Elderly ladies pushed over violently in the street. Homeless and inebriated people sleeping and living on the pavements. Shop staff have been terrorised. Neighbours have been attacked, intimidated and forced to move out of their homes. People have been shot at and stabbed in the street. Hard drug injecting in broad daylight on people's front steps. Invasions of people's property. Crack dealing and open smoking in the streets. This has been a litany of evidence and of despair, and it's overwhelmed us, and that's why we've come to appeal to you this evening. It's not an exaggeration to say it is a crisis. The police have confirmed that 50% of their caseload is due to inmates of the hostels that we have in the ward. We actually have 50% of the borough's severe support needs housing in the local area. Now, of course, people who have drug addiction and alcohol abuse and mental illness, and often these three go together, they need help, they need compassion, and they need a managed route back to health and back to happiness. As I've said at many meetings, but for the grace of God, it could be any one of us. However, there are problems that the council can solve. Over-concentration in one small area, a culture and a community of addictive lifestyles, a tipping point of mutual reinforcement, a focus for drug dealers to be attracted in, tourists to beg from, to fund the addiction, a set of circumstances that sustain this addictive lifestyle, an unbalanced mix of housing types. Many of our 40% private rentals are very run down and unmaintained and are very cheap conversions. A lot of them are single units, bedsits, or HMO units still with shared facilities. They're very poorly maintained. 20% of the ward has absentee landlords. We've got 25 unviable and very run-down hotels. And all this cheap accommodation is being used as, I have to say, a dumping ground. So we have a concentration of health and social problems. And we've only got 25% of owner-occupied units, compared with, as you saw from Dr. Quirk this evening, that the borough is 40% owner-occupiers. We've got 25%. Private rented, the borough has 30%. We have 45%. So you see, we reversed that completely. So we have a completely unbalanced housing mix. So we need to rebalance our community. I would like to thank my fellow councillors, Hamish and Linda, for their hard work in writing the report and compiling this huge amount of evidence that we've gathered. I would like to thank the lead members, Councillor Kamali and Councillor Will, because they've been down to the ward and they've seen with their own eyes the reaction from residents. Council officers have produced the data and very accurate professional evidence. We'd like to thank Robert Shaw and Kojo Sarpong and Gareth Wall and Dan Hawthorne. And finally, Jackie Heard, for her very reliable support as ever in preparing what's before you this evening. She has produced this with her usual precision and accuracy. And so thank you. Our Earls Court community, some are here this evening, is confident that you will hear their cries for help and request from you that leadership will look at these issues and recommendations and will take action. So councillors call for action. Thank you.
So who'd like to go next? Hamish and then Linda.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to begin with, I want to stress one thing. We obviously recognise that antisocial behaviour is an issue that is suffered to different degrees in other wards. And we don't for one moment to say that this is something that's Earls Court only, it's only Earls Court. But we do believe that we have a unique set of circumstances in our ward, which Councillor Spalding, I'm sure Councillor Wade later will allude to, and is sufficiently serious for us to bring this evening to your attention, along with our recommendations. There are two sides to this. There's policing, which is, in other words, how we deal with the symptoms, and the other is how we deal with the root causes of why we have so many individuals who sadly cause antisocial behaviour in our ward, and why, crucially, they are not receiving the support that they need. Our recommendations, as you will have seen, cut across community safety, adult social care, housing and planning, and seek to address both these sides. We know they cannot all be implemented in one go. Some are longer term in nature. Some require additional funding in a time of restrained budgets. But we do believe they should be the starting point of a serious conversation about what actions we can take as a council and what we can rightly expect our partner agencies to do as well. We do not accept that it is inevitable that an area has to enter a downward spiral and there is nothing that we can do about it. We wouldn't be here as councillors if that's what we thought. We will not accept also that Earls Court has, as some have commented in the past, has always been like this. It's always about drugs, and that's just how it is. There are countless examples across the country of areas that have been turned around by concerted action between the local authority, multiple agencies, residents, and of course the private sector. On that note, a few days ago, I was speaking to the owner of a laundrette on Earls Court Road, who described the appalling incidents of drug addicts intimidating elderly members of staff, other customers, breaking into a shop and using it as a dormitory. Across the road from the laundrette is our local Sainsbury's on Earls Court Road. Having a conversation with the store managers there, they're almost immune to the drug addicts who wander in and out throughout the day, shoplifting, short-staffed already themselves. They have neither the time nor the energy to be dealing with each of these incidents one by one. let alone reporting them and adding to the, shall I say, infamous Earls Court ASB statistics that we are routinely told do not measure up to what we are claiming and our residents are telling us. If these worthwhile amenities close, what are they going to be replaced with? More fast food shops on Earls Court roads, more betting shops, perhaps nothing at all. You may say, and perhaps I'm being cynical, well, that's just the free market at work. Maybe that's what residents in Earls Court want. Well, I can assure you, Chair, members, that that is not the case. But if we are to attract the new businesses for the future who can truly help improve our area, we must tackle the aggressive begging, the intimidation, and the other types of antisocial behaviour that have sadly become all too normalised on our streets. And I thank you for listening.
Linda?
Right. We've got to W. Right. This call to action is a culmination of the very many complaints and concerns that have been mounting over the years from residents about what they see is happening to where they live. Residents are frustrated, frightened, and increasingly angry about the lack of ownership of the problems that they're experiencing and the lack of an overarching strategy and commitment to address the multi-layered issues that contribute to the problem. 1,109 residents signed the recent Earls Court Safer Neighbourhood Ward panel petition, irrespective of tenure, age, wealth, or ethnicity. They're fed up with aggressive begging, not feeling safe in their homes, the explosion of overt drug dealing and use on their doorsteps. They're fed up. Many would like to sell or transfer out of the area due to the present declining situation. It's too simplistic to cite the usual suspects, and the borough has a large part to play. Their decisions lead to outcomes that have effectively had to be managed by others, such as the police, or place a burden on the long-term population. The borough can be instrumental for change, for improvement across different departments such as housing, adult social care, licensing, and planning. Each and every one of these departments has a responsibility, and that cannot work in a silo without reference or consideration of the combined impact. Earls Court as an area is at a crossroads. This is an opportunity to develop a central strategy to bring the area together across different departments, external agencies, in recognition of the concerns expressed by residents. This is an opportunity to actively listen and take appropriate actions and shape what is needed before things escalate further. Decisions made at licensing and planning can be active agents for change. The loss of retail shops in favour of gaming and massage parlours is not conducive for other businesses to thrive. And as one councillor after a recent planning application said, well, Earls Court is sleazy. That attitude must change, and that must start at the top, as the impact on business will see a downward spiral on our high street and a further exodus of the very many residents that have made improvements to the area, investing in it over many years. We have to remove the stigma of housing association tenants. They are as much impacted by ASB as others. There must be far greater working between the borough and RSLs. The borough nominates to RSLs, and their recommendations in the report made that specifically identify some key issues, such as sensitive letting, data exchange on nomination, and amalgamations to provide different configurations to reduce problems. The relationships between RSLs and the borough must change. They are the main supplier to meet your housing need. And we must remember that the same problems occur in tenancies with private landlords. It's unfortunate that Kensington and Chelsea did not benefit from the recent uplift in police numbers in the tri-borough policing area, and that must be actively pursued. We need a base for the Safer Neighbourhood team in Earls Court to rebuild public trust and the relationship with the police. Earls Court has become a destination location for some of the elements that are causing the problems. We have our usual suspects, and the specialist-supported housing units do need to be more proactive. But British Transport Police must take action to prevent people coming through the barriers, begging at their entrance, liaising with Boots so it's not the only methadone dispensing chemist in the area, attracting people from out of area to collect their scripts. This is a task that must be taken on. It must be multi-agency, but most importantly, it must be actioned with conviction and with a set of outcomes that are clear for both residents and businesses to understand, and that everybody has a part to play. This task needs to be agreed and put in place immediately to secure the safety of residents and the future of Earl's Court. We all need to take accountability and need to work together to offer residents of Earl's Court a residence promise. Thank you.
Linda. So, are there any residents who would actually like to speak to the meeting? If you wish to do so. This gentleman here is going to speak first, and then... Thank you.
As a shop owner, as the councillors have very kindly passed some very honest comments on the situation, I and my son, we've been here for the last 30 years, but I don't think I'm going to survive for another few months. The situation with the drug addicts is catastrophic. The police do very little. Those support wardens, or whatever they call themselves, are useless. Our staff are terrified, but what really annoys me more than anything, we have many elderly, or we had many elderly customers, 70, 80, 90 years of age, who religiously came in once a week for a bit of company or to do their washing. They've all gone because they're terrified. And what are the council and the police doing about it? Little or nothing. We can't survive anymore. They're happy to demand the rates and threaten us for the rates. I don't know how they can take a penny off us. The situation we're in. It's scandalous, absolutely scandalous. Thank you.
Would the gentleman at the back like to speak, or...? Okay. The lady there would like to say something.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I live at 1 Redfield Lane. I have a hostel right opposite, more or less opposite my house, and I've lived there for about 40 years, and I feel that my neighbours opposite of the vulnerable people, they're like my brothers and sisters, because I'm so accustomed to them. And the other day, the flat opposite, the gentleman who owned it left to go and live somewhere nicer. He rented it out, and the family that moved in were really nice people, and they were in absolute shock and horror because they said at night they could hear a lot of noise and things go, and a lot of funny people around. He said, "Who are all these funny people?" And a few days later, his daughters were in the passageway from Kenway Road to Cromwell Road, opposite the Cromwell Hospital, and they came across a group of these unfortunate people openly injecting themselves. They sit in the doorway of 171 Cromwell Road, which is in the alleyway. And so I said, oh dear, I'm so sorry. I run the Residents Association, Earls Court Village. And I said, well, I'll see what I can get done about it, because I'm so used to all these things. It doesn't shock me at all when we have a load of blood around in the alleyway. And so of course, I got in touch immediately with Linda Wade, and Malcolm, and they got in touch with the manager of the hostel. They got in touch with the police, and they got in touch with the officer in the council who's in charge of all the hostels and the vulnerable people. And they pulled out their fingers, and it was improved a lot in that area. And it was quite impressive, I thought, that all the police and the council officers and the hostel managers all pulled together and got it sorted. But we still have people late at night coming and shouting up at the hostel, which is wakes us all up. But I noticed on the back doors of the hostel, which is in Redfield Lane, there's a notice saying, no loiterers. And I think I was quite amused at that, because presumably that's their way of helping the situation and asking these people who shout in the middle of the night and 2 o'clock in the morning when we can't sleep, not to stand there shouting. But there's no police around to look at them, find out who they are, and the hostel doesn't have a camera. I think it might have a camera at the back, but it doesn't have any sound apparatus, so they can't hear the noise that's going on. Anyway, it would be great if the area was a bit tidier. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to speak next, and then the lady over the other side?
Hi. So I just kind of moved back into the borough in June, but had lived here for 4 years while I was in university, and I really like the area. I've always been loyal to it. But actually, to echo what the lady who was just sitting next to me said about kind of becoming almost desensitized to things. When I first moved back in June, kind of naturally you kind of have people over to your house. And so the first time I had my older sister over, she's got my 6-year-old nephew. She came over, it was when the Earls Court Wonderground was on, so we went there with my nephew. Afterwards, we went for dinner together, and so it was a little bit late for him than usual. But we were walking back from a restaurant on Earls Court Road onto Pennywell Road, where I live, because my sister was parked there. And a lady approached who clearly was known to business owners in the area, and I'll explain why in a second, asking for money. And very politely, we just said no. Very politely, very respectfully, and tried to move on, but she started following us. And then, bearing in mind, like, I'm someone who's kind of, trying to show off my area very nicely to a family member who's quite local, my sister kind of doesn't want to come back now, because that lady, when my sister said no to giving her money, said, I'm going to take your son away from you. So we then, at the very top of Pennywell Road, there's a corner store. And this is how I can echo what the lady next to me said about how when you're in the area, you almost become desensitized to these things. Because obviously immediately when that lady said this to my sister, we jumped into that corner store and asked the gentleman who runs it, who I speak to quite regularly, asked the gentleman who runs it to lock the door, and explained why. And he almost he didn't not want to lock the door, if that made sense, but he kind of gave an explanation for why it wasn't super urgent to knock the door. Because he was like, oh no, we know who she is, so she doesn't mean what she's saying, she's just crazy. So that also kind of means, it's quite a regular occurrence. And as I said, I really love the area. I returned to it for a reason. I have a lot of happy memories here, and I generally feel quite safe, but then again, I don't know if that's because, as the lady who was just speaking next to me said, is because I'm just quite used to the area, and I suppose quite brazen in that sense, because when my sister came here, who used to live in London, but she lived in Islington, she lives in Surrey now, she just kind of hasn't come back since with my little nephew because of that happening.
Thank you. I think the lady here would also like to speak.
Thank you. Hello. I've actually lived in the borough most of my life, but I've lived in Earls Court for 25 years. And I've always loved it because it's mixed. It's a bit rough on the edges and not too polished. But latterly, it's really become too much. And we've all worked very, very hard. I've been quite active in the Earls Court Society to try and tidy up the area and all the rest of it. And we felt we were making very good headway, I'd say about 10 years ago. But probably about a year, maybe 2 years before COVID struck, you got the sense that there were too many homeless people on the street, or certainly too many people with mental health problems, too many drug addicts. And then, because I've been working at home, I've been much more aware. Every day, virtually, there is one or maybe two people who walk down our street screaming and ranting. And clearly, these are people who are very ill. Frequently, people in our block have complained that when they come home, they're met with people sitting on the doorstep taking drugs. Hard drugs. I'm not just talking about smoking pot here. These are people who are using pipes, freebasing, I don't know all the terms, and are very aggressive. Normally, I don't use the exit to the tube on Earls Court Road, but I have been recently for various reasons, and I've been shocked, absolutely shocked. It's like bedlam. There are people begging aggressively on the road, and it's very, very intimidating, very unpleasant. How people with small children cope with that, I do not know. And then to listen to you, I was heartbroken. The laundrette is one of the most important units on the Earls Court Road, very much because people meet there. People who are not necessarily that well off. Obviously, if they go to a laundrette, they haven't got their own washing machine. But they meet also for social reasons, for company, and to hear that they're too scared to go there now is absolutely heartbreaking. And to think that we might lose the laundrette is terrible. But the real thing that annoys me at the moment is this not joined up thinking within different council committees. And the idea that just because Earls Court is regarded as not particularly smart, that it's okay if we get yet another horrible establishment like the one that was approved recently by the planning committee, another gambling establishment, a slot machine establishment. Do we need this? No, it'll cement the demise of our street. But instead of using quite obvious reasons within the, I forgot the name of the document, but the council's intentions, they let it pass. So yet again, there will be more opportunity for people with mental health problems to congregate and cause more problems. And we need joined up thinking on this because the area is really going to pot at the moment and it's very, very serious. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I must say I'm very sympathetic to what you say. I have lived in the area for over 26 years and walked up and down the Earls Court Road almost every day. And I know that what you're saying is true, and I have seen it myself. And I also think it is getting worse. I think that really is true. It was not as bad when I was first in the area. It's a question of what we can do. I know this came up in plan. I think Councillor Wade is right in what the council can actually do. I mean, I have looked at all your recommendations, but planning and licensing are the areas that we have some control over. And I think we raised this, or I raised this in one licensing committee for one of these establishments. I think it was a 24-hour booze thing in the Earls Court Road, you know, an off-licence. And other councils have sort of special areas where they limit the number of things. Now, we have not gone down that road in terms of licensing. So what we always say is we have to take each, you know, each sort of case on its merits, and that's how it's looked at. But I agree there have been decisions recently which have not been helpful to Earls Court. But so I've said what I have to say. I've read your recommendations, so I'm now going to ask other members of the committee. Ah, sorry, someone else I've left out. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. And I'd also like to thank the councillors for their support and putting together the paper, which I think is a very, very well put together piece, and I appreciate that. Again, I'm James Aker. I've lived on Tenure Road now for 25 years, I think it is, and I'd just like to say that unfortunately things really have deteriorated in the last 3 years or so, and I really would just like to say I very much agree with the summary of the fellow residents here, and can we try and do something to work in a multi-agency fashion to try and tackle this? I do think when the Metropolitan Police closed their local establishment in the Earls Court Village area, that lack of presence from the Met, I think, has caused an uptick in antisocial behaviour. So I really think that was a negative development. But I would really like members of the council to really dwell on the report which has been produced here, because there's a lot of very, very sensible recommendations which, as a weary resident who struggles to sleep many nights because of the noise and the disturbance, I'd really just like to say thank you to the councillors for putting this together, and encourage the rest of the council to really look at taking some serious action. I could go into graphic details of things I've seen on the street over the last 2 days, but I'll spare you those, and just say thank you very much again to the 3 of my councillors here who've been, I know, working really hard.
I'd like to say thank you to all of our councillors who work so hard to try and make Earls Court a better place to live. I've lived in Earls Court since I was 12, and I live in Kenway Road. There's been stabbing. There's a man who, I have glass windows, and I teach children, and I have a man who regularly comes along and exposes himself. I have rung the police. They've never managed to catch the guy because he's gone down the street or whatever. I have got a bad video of it that doesn't show his face enough, so that's no good at all. But the children I work with, it's totally unsuitable that they should be seeing things like this happen. There are Narain, our local mini market. They've stopped selling milk because the milk arrives early and the crates just go. And they say that they have 3 loaves from their pile of bread that goes every day. The shoplifting has gone on for ages. Nothing happens about it. I don't see a policeman around. I don't see a warden around. When we used to have in Kenway Road, the police hub there, it was great. But it's been a real loss to the whole area. And there's regular, as been mentioned by the Earls Court Tube, aggressive begging, aggressive demands, which is scary. And I don't see why the parents who come with their children should be subjected to this. I've worked looking after dyslexic children for years, and it gets worse.
Okay, thank you.
Drug dealing also, there's a usual drug dealer. I haven't seen him recently, but he's a sort of Indian, and he has a long ponytail. The police know him well. I haven't actually just seen him recently, so maybe he's gone inside for a bit. But thank you for listening.
Thank you. So I will go to for comment, Councillor Hammond.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I think that the choice we've got as a committee, as a scrutiny committee, is to accept or reject what we've got in front of us. And if we accept it, it needs to go forward to the leadership team for a concerted action. And I very strongly think that that's what we should do. I would completely endorse what Malcolm and his colleagues have said, and backed up by the evidence we've heard from the Earls Court residents, which I personally recognise, having lived south of Earls Court, north of Earls Court, now east of Earls Court, and briefly lodging in Earls Court. And the ward that Janet and I represent, is immediately to the east of Earls Court, and some of our streets share some of the characteristics of Earls Court, albeit perhaps not the extreme problems that have been described tonight, which I think are deeper into the Earls Court ward. I think the planning recommendations, particularly, I think the one about hotels, I recognise it from the local plan that's going through at the moment. That's a very sensible recommendation that's already being adopted, and just shows what can be done. And in fact, that one, and in fact all the planning ones, I think should apply to the whole SW5 postcode, not just to Earls Court ward, which is a slightly narrower area. And I think we should make that point, because that would encompass the area where that can make a difference.
Can I add that parts of SW10, where I used to live in Coleherne Road, Redcliffe Square, Eiffel Street, Wolfdale Road, they're all just as bad, just the other side of the Old Brompton Road.
Yeah, I used to live in Wolfdale Street, and so I recognise that has had its challenges as well, but it's perhaps not the sort of core bit either side of Earls Court Road, which is what's being described. And the first set of recommendations, numbers 1.1 to 1.6, about supported accommodation, I think, as far as I know, that's deep into Earls Court, and I don't know where these establishments are exactly, but I'm sure my colleagues will tell me afterwards. But I completely understand the problems being that's set out there. With the external placements at 1.7, I think we're now not talking about rough sleepers, we're talking about home office contracts, because the biggest hotel is actually in our ward, the Ambassador's Hotel, and it's a home office contract for asylum seekers. But I know there's at least 5 hotels, smaller hotels in Earls Court ward itself, which are being used by the Home Office at the moment. So yes, I completely support what Malcolm and his colleagues have brought forward tonight, and I would like the committee to adopt it, and hope that we will.
Hammond, and I'd just like to add that I think we know, or certainly the councils know, that some of the people who present as homeless and beg and whatever are not actually, who cause problems on the streets, they're not actually homeless. They come from hostels. I think we do know that. Councillor Addenbrooke.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to endorse what Councillor Hammond has said. I live in a neighbouring ward, and we're seeing more and more ASB and begging, which is directly attributed to one of the hostels in particular. They walk up through by the Cromwell Hospital up to High Street Kensington Tube Station. So, I mean, yes, absolutely. I think we should send these recommendations to the leadership team. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Evans.
Yes, thank you for coming tonight and sharing with us. I completely support what you have said, and I support the councillors. I would like to add that we must take into consideration licensing, because with licensing, I think we have to take into consideration the area, because it seems you clearly have problems as a result of some of the venues, and with the gambling, etc. There are people who've lived in the streets just gambling. I've seen it in our own ward in South Kensington. And we will help you. So you have our support, and it affects not only your ward, but surrounding wards. So I think we must address it, and we cannot push this under the carpet. Thank you.
Also, I think having an investigation into these matters, there are elements of the problems in other wards, and I think sort of bringing it to the attention of the leadership team will make them kind of look at the whole thing across the borough as well, which I think, you know, this would be like the first step, but I think it will be very helpful in general. Councillor Pascal.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome you here. Thank you for coming, and good to listen to what, well, I say good to listen, it's good to listen, but not the story that you're telling us. But, I also welcome the point that one of the speakers made about the recognition that the components of these problems, or all of these problems, do exist elsewhere in the borough. So it is a problem, as you've exemplified for Earl's Court, but it's also an issue that we as a council as a whole need to pay more attention to, I feel. And therefore, if we were to support this, as I do, it should be an example of the need to join up and coordinate all the officers who are dealing with your area, but also with the areas across the borough. It needs to be a focused piece of work with some just further tightening of the objectives and agreement between the agencies as to what is realistic, and some measure of how outcomes can be judged to be successful or otherwise. Because it's only by doing that that we can achieve things in this area, but also learn lessons that will be useful for other parts of the borough. I represent a ward further south. We have not the same concentration that you do, but we do have pockets of the same problems. And our notice is that it's spreading. And these problems don't recognise borough borders either. So I think it's important that whilst other boroughs are run differently and separately, that there is some joining up through agencies such as the police and so on across borough boundaries. And I think that the whole area of the lots of resources the council and other agencies put onto the street, if it was better focused under a sort of banner of street management in a coordinated way, so that you could relate to one organisation rather than a series of different business streams of work which don't talk to each other. Now this is going to require quite a lot of work back office within the council as well as on the street. It needs good work on the street, but it needs information systems, etc., within the council that are much more developed than we have at the moment. So I don't underestimate the scale of this work. I think some of it is being addressed, but it needs, I think I would support a case study, a pilot, or whatever you want to call it, focusing on Earl's Court, but also leading to examples, leading to knowledge of how to handle things better across the whole borough.
Thank you, Councillor Pascal. Councillor Mobatia.
Thank you, Chair. I have been talking about antisocial behavior and crime in the borough for the past 5 years, and I have proposed motions, and the last motion I proposed was, I think, 2 months ago, police kiosk in the borough, which was amended and passed unanimously. I am aware I have got this type of issues in my ward, but not like yours. Residents being brave enough coming here, telling us about their stories and how you've been terrorized, intimidated and bullied by few individuals. This is really, really sad. So I think we need to do something about it. You have our support, and we will endorse what Councillor Hammond said, and the ward councillors, we support them. Thanks for your bravery and for coming here. Thank you.
Marwan.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not going to speak much except thanking you for sharing your story. It's quite upsetting in some sense, and it requires, as we can see, a joint effort, multi-agency approach, and this should not go any longer without proper addressing. So I really fully endorse our fellow councillors who brought this issue to us, and thank you so much for coming and being brave to tell us the unique stories, sharing this with us. So I fully endorse this one to go to the leadership for more coordinated action across departments to address these issues and deal with it for good. And so thank you.
Lindsay, do you wish to say something?
There's nothing I want to say that has not been said before, but I completely concur, and I think it should be sent to the leadership team.
Okay, so I believe we have a consensus. So yes, I think what we'll do, everyone is agreed that this needs to go to the leadership team. I think the points that have been, we accept the recommendations, we put them forward to the leadership team. I think the points that have been made about licensing and planning are very important, and that's something that perhaps we could, I mean, you have your planning recommendations, but you don't have, you know, I think it's called a cumulative effect area. In some boroughs they have them. I think that could be, I would suggest another recommendation, number 24, because that would focus licensing in thinking about the area itself. I know that it won't be popular, and I think the other points that also have to be made are that there are a lot of agencies involved, and that a multi-agency approach is what's required. There's not one single solution to this. There has to be lots of solutions, and I also agree with kind of bringing this problem into the spotlight will help issues across the borough, and this will be like a pilot. Councillor Addenbrook.
Thank you, Chair. And in fact, we talk about adult social care, but I really think, and we talk about the multi-agency approach, but I really think we need to get health more engaged in this, and particularly the mental health teams. So I don't know whether you want to add another recommendation.
Yep. So that would be number 25. Is that, Jackie, we are allowed to add recommendations, are we not?
Yes, when you refer it to the leadership team, you report, so either the councillors can add the recommendations, or you can say as a leadership team, you've considered, you fully support what the 3 ward councillors and the residents have said. So I can draft up a cover report tomorrow with the additional 2, if you want.
It was within the council and CNWL, and we had meetings with both of them, and they wouldn't agree. In fact, they were all right. So that was one of the problems we had when we interviewed them. Neither of them would really engage. Actually,
I think we all agreed that the recommendations go forward to the leadership team. We're adding a couple. Which Jackie has a note of, so it just remains for me to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I'm very sorry to hear what you have been experiencing, but I have seen some of it myself firsthand, and I'd also like to thank all 3 Earls Court councillors. A lot of work has gone into this, and a lot of determination, and so yeah, I would like to thank the Earls Court councillors for bringing this to us tonight. Thank you. On to A7. I can't find it. So that leads us to the Scrutiny work programme. As you all know, we're coming to the end of the year. So I think I'll go around each of you individually. But to say in terms of OSC, we are setting up the working group to look into the flooding issue. There are papers on it. I don't know, David, if you would like to say something about that. And also there is an invitation for other members of OSC to join that working group if they would like to say so now. David.
Trey, thank you. I think all I want to say is that clearly for my ward, Norland, it's a very topical issue, but it affected Holland in measure, Nottingdale in measure, Pembridge in measure, Colville in measure, and I'm sure there were wards further south as well. It is a live issue and it's going to continue. And there are many residents who are concerned, fearful even, that if it rains, they're going to get flooded. There are many residents who are aware that their insurance premiums, if they can get insurance, might double this year and then might double again next year. Now, for a year that may be sustainable, but for several years in a row, that's probably not sustainable, and that's really problematic. What's going to happen between now and 10 years' time, when it would be the earliest, reasonably, that we could expect new capacity to come on board? What should the role of Ofwat be? Because Ofwat has not been possibly, and I'm being kind, as rigorous in holding Thames Water and indeed other water authorities and companies in terms of what they ought to be doing, as we will have seen in the news recently. So these are the sorts of things that we want to look at. We do not want to duplicate anything that's currently being done. Some of the things that we can make suggestions about, recommendations about, for example, Ofwat, for example, specifically also insurance, will have to be done in Parliament, but the aim would be to produce a suitable sized report, some of which will go to Felicity Barkin and Greg Hands, who are our MPs, some of which will also go to other local authorities in London and the GLA, because this is a London-wide issue. But anybody who has any questions, please ask. And I should just say, one of my suggestions, and I have asked and she's agreed to be one of the residents on it, is a certain Sophia Lambert, who will be known to a few of you, but in her last job as a Mandarin, she was responsible, amongst other things, for flooding and flood defences in the DCLG as it was then. So I'd have thought we could not have a better person as a resident to be helping us, and I know that it would help her to tie certain things that she wanted to have tied up when she was a Mandarin, but couldn't.
Thanks, David. Do we have any volunteers that would like to be on this working group? Members of the Select Committee? I don't know. You're too busy. Okay, so we'll leave that till afterwards. Okay, we'll sort it out later.
I know that Kasim Ali said he did on the time before, and I don't know why Will's hand is up now.
I wanted to answer a question about the terms of reference. Because the thing that really puzzles me over all this is as to, and maybe Sophia Lambert can shed some light on this from her experience, who is responsible for pulling together? Because there seem to be separate jobs done by separate organisations, and there's no pulling together. At the end of the day, our residents want the problem solved. They're not interested in whether organisation A has done organisation A's job, but it's whether the situation has been grasped holistically. And it is complex. And you say it's London-wide, but it's also to do with climate change, it's to do with rising sea levels, it's to do with, a whole number of development issues, etc. So it is very wide in scope. But unless somebody or some organisation somewhere pulls this all together, it's going to be divided up into bits. And the bits might function separately, but the system doesn't function overall. And it wasn't clear when Ofwat and Thames Water were sitting where I am that they actually presented a clear picture as to who they thought was responsible. In many cases, things they said that it wasn't them. They were partly responsible for their bit, but there wasn't any overall. Now, whether that's London management through the mayor, or whether it's national government, because we only have a role as a flood risk authority, but we are within a system, we have limited powers. So I think they're trying to find a clarification as to who should be asked to take a grip.
So David, I think Jackie also wants to add something here, but David...
I just want to say, Will, points taken on board, but I'm not going to give you an answer now.
No, I didn't expect you to have an answer. If you did, you've solved the problem to a large degree.
Jackie, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is the Section 19 report that the Planning Department, the Flood Risk Officer, has commissioned, which will look at the floods in July and the responsibilities of the different agencies. So some of that information will be in that report. obviously I'm not saying that's going to solve the problem. And then there is the independent review set up by Thames Water, and I think that should look at, I can't speak on their behalf, but I imagine that that would look at some of the issues that you've raised about responsibilities and agencies working together. So we'll see what we get.
So do I sense that what you're saying is that the ability to work on this as a working group will be much enhanced, maybe in sort of May, June of this year, when those reports have come through?
Will be source documents. Sorry, did you want to speak, Councillor? I think there'll be source documents for the working group.
I think it will be iterative, and we will make progress and we will see what happens. But clearly, as and when the independent review comes through, that will be a help. But I think if we see it also as being an opportunity to help residents to see exactly who is responsible for what, and have a nice short executive summary, and no more than 6 recommendations, and the rest can be in an appendix with them, because we want to be very deferential to Jackie in this regard. We'll take it from there.
I think at this point we've got a dual function. It's holding Thames Water to account, and also Ofwat, because we haven't really, I don't think, been strong enough with them. And the other thing is we are amplifying the concerns of the residents. I'm not sure about overall responsibility. Are you talking about legal responsibility and all the rest of it? Because they're going to try and wiggle out of that.
We can't hold them. We cannot do that overall, but we can make it clear where overall responsibility lies, so that those people who are unclear do actually understand.
Okay, thank you, Jay. I'll turn to Janet now. If you would like, is there anything about your work programme, given we are almost at the end now?
Well, 2 things. We had in September a SEND review, Special Education Needs and Disabilities, and we are reviewing it. We gave them 6 months, and we are reviewing it at the next meeting in March. And so that is a work in progress. We had our safeguarding meeting in December, but we still have not received a full safeguarding report. So we are waiting from that from the government. And we had something that's come up, which has to do with Holland Park School. A similar situation, we had a lot of residents contacting us. It's an academy, so we can't exactly get involved with academies. However, what we are dealing with, we have invited the parents to come to our meeting on the 21st. We've allotted half an hour. We're starting earlier. And the parents, we will listen and hear exactly what's happened. And it's a good chance for them to share with us so we can put together an idea of how to help them. And what I am thinking of doing is that we will probably move it to the next year of scrutiny. We will suggest it as a topic because it seems to be very urgent. And that are the changes. And we've dealt with serious youth violence and domestic abuse throughout the year. So, but the Holland Park is a very pressing issue. It affects quite a few families, and we have to look at how to approach and work with the academies. It's a similar situation to what we saw with Earl's Court, where they have a situation dealing with the police. So that is not within our jurisdiction. However, we have to work with the police on that situation. So it's a question for scrutiny, is how we help, and we can look how it fits into what is within our remit and how we can help the residents. And so we are starting with listening, just as we did tonight. And I thought that was a very good way to start.
Thank you, Janet. Marwan, I know you had a very good, I missed your last meeting, I'm sorry, but you had a good report on mental health in North Kensington.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it was a very good meeting, Madam Chair. The main focus, it was from the working group on the mental health in North Kensington. The recommendation, it's being carried forward for further work. And the overall on public health and other social care issues. Before that, we discussed on the budget. So, yeah, the work is still to be continued, and hopefully we made that recommendation for further work program. And would like to see a review, actually, what's happened over the last year. And that's on discussion, so hopefully that will be taken forward to see what lesson learned, and making sure that the expectation is well managed in terms of what can be done and what cannot be done. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you very much for your support as well.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In our group this year, we've done a lot of work on the local plan, which is a major forward piece of planning-related work, which many of you will have seen the consultations on. Perhaps our key focus has been on the 2030 Council commitment to net carbon zero. We've been through, had presentations from within the Officer Corps, but also from outside on the technology, the plan forward, the procurement, and also how it is going to be financed. We've worked with Audit and Transparency Committee on identifying the risk, and I've spoken particularly about tonight, under the previous agenda items, about HRA finance, because I still think that there are some confusions within the reports from one Environment Directorate, Environment Communities Directorate, and the way that it's been brought forward within the HRA budget. And we've made a recommendation, which I've repeated tonight, that further work needs to be done. That's been adopted within the HRA paper that went to Council. And I made a suggestion tonight as an area where there could be some change to the approach to save the immediate funding problem of between 20 and 40 million out of the £100 million shortfall they have at the moment. Overall, I would say that there's been some good progress, particularly from the housing group and Doug Goldring, but the work needs to be speeded up because the commitment was made over 11 years, and we've already used 3 of those years, and we've got 8 left. Otherwise than that, there is the whole area of looking at carbon net zero across the whole borough, because the work under the 2030 commitment by the council, as big as it is, and as difficult as it is for the council, is only 1% of what needs to be done within the borough as a whole. And this work on the 2040, which will obviously be a job for next year's committee, should it take it forward, is to address conversations between the borough and the partners across the whole borough. Sorry, the council and the partners across the whole borough, including such organisations as Albertopolis, the NHS, the high street organisations, housing providers, and then residents associations and local residents in conservation areas and such like. Little items like how to do double glazing in a conservation area are going to be very difficult to solve because they cross a whole lot of boundaries with regard to planning policy, conservation policy, etc. But unless we solve those as a borough and come up with recommendations and ways of managing that, we won't be able to achieve the 2040 objective. So those are the things that we laid out. Other areas that we considered are the culture plan and some other issues which are listed here. But that's the focus for our committee this year.
So do any other members have anything to say about the work programme?
Do you want to hear about housing, Chair? Yes, so on the housing communities programme in Kasim's absence, we've had the 2 half-day conferences since we last met. So the first one was on housing theme with the registered providers, and it's the second year we've done it. We have 14 this year turned up, which is the vast majority of those that operate within the borough. and that's double the number that came last year. So that was an extremely successful day and a good liaison and a good way of making contacts, which I've certainly used subsequently to that day. And then more recently, we've had our communities conference, which was split into two halves. The first half focused on the Grenfell Projects Fund, and then the second half focused on food insecurity and the borough's role in coordinating the work of the third parties, the food banks, and so on. And again, that was very interesting, and the recommendations from that one are being drafted as we speak. One more Housing and Community Select Committee to go of the term, and that will be considering an update of the fire risk management, which we haven't done for a year or so, in fact for 2 years, so we're well overdue an update on that. And we're considering temporary accommodation for the first time for a while as well.
I must say, I found the communities, the round table discussions very helpful. I thought they were very good. We've got one more OSC meeting, and we are looking at community safety. We're also going to look at the local economy, and actually we are going to scrutinise Council of Folks that we haven't, Catherine has not really had any scrutiny, so that will be good. And we'll have a report from Jackie on the work programme.
You've got community safety plan as well.
Madam Chair.
Oh yeah, sorry, I missed it. Yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned community safety. That seems to relate pretty strongly to the Earls Court presentation that we had tonight. And I'm just wondering whether certainly the councillors involved in tonight should be invited to come and listen to that piece.
Yes, except it was a call to action, and we've referred it to the leadership team.
No, sorry. You were saying that at our next meeting,
yes,
we're going to have an item on community safety.
Yes.
Yes. So
I think
that item would be of interest to the three councillors from Earls Court, I would have thought, and we should just ask them if they wish to attend the meeting.
Yes, yes. And I think we are inviting Emma Will, are we? And
yeah, the lead member will be invited, and obviously all councillors can come to the scrutiny committee. It's open to all.
Yeah. Okay.
Therese, are we going to be having the Borough Commander or just Stuart Priestley?
Jackie's going to answer that.
You had the Borough Commander for this year in July, so you will be seeing the Borough Commander again, but not at that meeting. It's a different scrutiny. This is a plan that's on its way to full council, so it's to get your input into it, but we will be doing that again.
I think we get the Borough Commander once a year, don't we?
Yes, and I was talking to Councillor Hammond about that a few months ago. We had some ideas for what we could do, but I haven't picked that up, but we'll pick it up after the election.
Now we have the key decisions, and the only thing I've got to say is this, that twice recently, one very recently, and just before as well, I've had 2 urgent key decisions sent to me, which I felt weren't really urgent. I said yes to both of them because I felt I had to, but the reason I didn't think they were urgent, and I think Jack is going to look into this, is someone let the timetable slip, and therefore it's okay to do it as an urgent KD, as if that's an option if you mess up. So I did feel that 2 of them should not have been urgent KDs, but I did pass them anyway. And are you going to look into that, Jackie, how that happened?
Sorry, Chair, I have asked the officers if I could have an explanation on your behalf, yes. It's in process.
Chair, which department were they from?
The first was to do with finance, and it was to do with procurement. The second was to do with housing, and it was a question of a grant, like not knowing about the grant until the day before, but the report was written on the 9th and I was actually asked on the 24th. I mean, it didn't quite add up to me that it was really urgent. And I'm just mentioning it because I think people, I mean, I have raised a query that urgent should not be when people mess up on their timescales. That does not mean urgent, but I did actually pass both of them anyway. But I don't want that to happen regularly, because then scrutiny is just a rubber stamp, and they just think, oh, we can just shove it through as an urgent KD when it's not really urgent. So, does anyone have anything to say on the KDs, that ones they want to pick up or look at? Okay, well, I'll say thank you very much for all coming. Thank you also to Jackie and to Robert.
Thank you,
and
Chair.
Tom. And yes, we will meet again on the 24th of March. Thank you.